The mansion loomed against the darkening sky, ivy clawing at its cracked stone walls. Courtney had called it Gothic, Kendall said it was a nightmare, but Kim couldn't deny the pull it had. It was old money, French architecture, imported marble, a private lake hidden behind centuries-old oaks. A legacy house, the broker said. A steal, considering its history. Kim wasn't one to believe in curses. The headlines called her a lot of things: drama queen, socialite, master of reinvention, but never superstitious. Yet, as she stood in the grand foyer, the air felt heavier, almost alive. The chandelier above, crystal teardrops coated in dust, swayed faintly despite the stillness. Mrs. Kardashian? The broker's voice cut through the silence, too bright, too eager. Shall we proceed with the tour? Kim's heels clicked softly on marble as she moved forward, eyes trailing over faded portraits lining the walls. Faces stared back, Victorian dresses, eyes dark and unblinking, each canvas more worn than the last. The final portrait caught her eye. A woman in a crimson gown, hands folded neatly, a small pendant gleaming at her throat. The resemblance was unsettling, the eyes, the arch of the brow. Kim took a step closer, fingertips brushing the cracked frame. The last owner, the broker said lightly. Lady Margaux Desmarais. Vanished without a trace in 1904. Poor thing. Rumors, of course, affairs, madness, curses. She laughed, a brittle sound. But you know how people talk. Kim's gaze lingered on the pendant, a black stone veined with crimson. It almost seemed to pulse in the dim light. That night, the house was silent but never truly still. The wind keened softly through the cracked windows, floorboards groaned as if under invisible steps. North and Saint were asleep, tucked beneath heavy quilts, their soft breaths the only sound in the dark. Kim couldn't sleep. The bedroom was vast, ceilings arched and shadowed, curtains heavy as gravestones. Her phone lay useless on the bedside table, no signal, no Wi-Fi. The service technician swore it would be fixed by morning, but every call cut off with static, voices warped and hollow. She rubbed her eyes, irritation flaring. Maybe Courtney was right. Maybe this was a mistake. The city was only an hour away, but out here, surrounded by acres of dark forest, it felt like a different world entirely. The sound came again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Kim froze, breath shallow, ear straining. Tap, tap, tap. From the hallway, slow and deliberate, like nails against wood. Her pulse quickened. Heartbeats roared in her ears, but she forced herself up, silk robe tied around her shoulders. The door creaked open, hallway yawning dark and empty. Moonlight slanted through stained glass windows, painting the walls in crimson and violet. She followed the sound, down the hall, past portraits that seemed to watch with dark, glassy eyes. The air grew colder with each step, breath fogging faintly. Tap, tap, tap. It led to a door she didn't remember seeing during the tour, half hidden behind a tapestry. Heavy oak, the kind that shouldn't exist in a California mansion. Her hand trembled as she gripped the handle, twisting slowly. The door groaned open, darkness spilling out. A room lay beyond, untouched by light or time. Dust hung thick, tapestries faded to gray, a fireplace cold and empty. But on the mantel, propped carefully, was the same pendant from the portrait, black stone veined with crimson, glinting in the dark. Kim's breath caught, fingers reaching before she could think. And then the door slammed shut behind her, light snuffed out, air turning bitterly cold. The shadows moved, whispering softly, and the pendant pulsed once, cold and hungry, beneath her fingertips. The darkness was suffocating. Kim's pulse hammered, fingers frozen around the pendant. The whispers swirled, soft and guttural, a language she didn't understand. She yanked her hand back, breath hitching, but the door wouldn't budge, heavy, unyielding. Nails scrabbled at wood, panic flaring hot and wild. Then, silence. A chill rolled through the room, and faintly, under the stale air, came the scent of lilies, sweet, decayed. Kim's eyes darted, breath shallow. In the gloom, a mirror hung crooked, glass warped and clouded. But the reflection wasn't hers. Lady Margaux stared back, eyes hollow, lips curved in a cold smile. The crimson pendant gleamed at her throat, pulsing in sync with Kim's heartbeat. Help me, the reflection mouthed, voice soundless but clear. Kim stumbled back, heart pounding. The shadows twisted, cold fingers brushing her wrist, pulling. And then the door flew open. Light flooded in, blinding. Kim gasped, stumbling into the hallway, silk robe damp with sweat. But when she glanced back, the room was empty, no pendant, no mirror, just dust and darkness. She backed away, hands trembling, eyes flickering to the portrait at the end of the hall. Lady Margaux's eyes seemed to glint, cruel and knowing. Morning light filtered through stained glass, painting the hallway in shards of crimson and violet. Kim's hands still trembled as she gripped her coffee, eyes fixed on the portrait of Lady Margaux. The resemblance was haunting. The eyes, the curve of the lips, as if time had folded back on itself. "Mom." North's voice broke the silence, small and hesitant. She stood in the doorway, pajama sleeves tugged over her hands. "There's a lady in my room." Kim's heart lurched. "A lady?" she echoed, forcing a smile. "Are you sure it wasn't a shadow, baby?" North shook her head, dark eyes wide. "She was watching me. She wore a red dress." The coffee cup trembled in Kim's grip. The crimson gown, Lady Margaux's. But that was impossible. She drew a slow breath, steadying her voice. "It was just a bad dream," she said softly, brushing a hand through North's hair. "This house is old. Shadows play tricks." But her own words tasted hollow. That afternoon, she searched every room. Dust clung to her skin, silence pressing down like a weight. Each door opened to emptiness. Rooms stripped bare, curtains drawn, mirrors draped in yellowed sheets. No red dress, no ghostly figures, just the stale air of a house that hadn't been alive in decades. The library was last. Shelves soared, filled with leather-bound volumes, spines cracked and faded. But one book lay open on the desk, its pages warped with age. Kim approached, fingers brushing the yellowed paper. A journal, handwritten, entries scrawled in dark ink, dates spanning decades. One line caught her eye, ink smudged but legible. The bloodline must remain. The debt must be paid. The words coiled cold in her gut. She turned the page, but the ink bled into crimson stains, a scent of lilies wafting faintly. And then a whisper, soft, right beside her ear. "You're not the first." Kim's breath hitched. She spun, eyes darting. But the library was empty, shadows still. Her fingers trembled against the journal, skin prickling with icy dread. She closed the book with a snap, pulse pounding. But as she turned to leave, the portrait above the fireplace glinted in the dim light. Lady Margaux, eyes dark and knowing, the crimson pendant gleaming at her throat. And for the briefest moment, Kim could have sworn the lips moved, curling into a smile. The storm rolled in by dusk, rain lashing against stained glass, thunder rattling the chandeliers. Kim paced the foyer, phone clenched tight, still no signal, no Wi-Fi. Every call cut off and static, voices warped and hollow. Saint and North stayed close, eyes wide each time lightning cracked. Even the housekeepers avoided the upper floors, muttering about drafts and flickering lights. But Kim wasn't imagining things. Not the whispers, not the cold spots, not the eyes that seemed to follow her from every portrait. She caught a glimpse of herself in the hall mirror, pale, eyes shadowed, hair tumbling loose. For a heartbeat, the reflection seemed to flicker. Not her eyes, but darker, colder. Kim's breath caught, fingers curling tight around the phone. The journal's words throbbed in her mind. The bloodline must remain. The debt must be paid. By midnight, the power died. The lamps fizzled out one by one, plunging the house into darkness. Kim lit candles with shaking hands, breath shallow, ears straining. Silence pressed in, thick and unnatural, broken only by the wind keening through cracked windows. North's voice was small, tugging at Kim's sleeve. "Mom, I saw her again," she whispered. "The lady in the red dress." Kim's blood turned to ice. "Where, baby?" "In the garden," North breathed, eyes glassy. She was crying. Kim's gaze snapped to the window. Beyond the rain-streaked glass, the garden sprawled wild and dark, shadows pooling beneath ivy-choked statues. But a light glinted faintly near the hedge maze, soft, wavering, like a lantern. She hesitated, fear coiling cold and tight. But North's eyes were wide, pleading. "Stay here," Kim ordered, voice trembling. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." The rain was ice, searing her skin as she stumbled through mud and brambles. Her robe soaked through in seconds, hair plastered to her cheeks. The path twisted, lanterns snuffed out, leaving only darkness and the low howl of wind. But through the storm, a figure moved, crimson gown trailing, black hair streaming. Lady Margaux's face was pale, eyes hollow, tears glinting in moonlight. "Wait!" Kim choked, slipping on wet stone. Her fingers grasped air, nails scraping bark. But the woman glided deeper into the maze, head tilted as if listening. Thunder roared. Lightning lit the sky, blinding white. And for a breath, Kim saw them, figures draped in black, circling the maze's edge. Faces masked, eyes dark and empty, watching. And then darkness crashed back, rain freezing, shadows swallowing the path. Kim's breath came shallow, chest heaving, fingers numb around a branch. A whisper hissed from the dark, soft and venomous. The debt must be paid. And before she could scream, cold hands gripped her wrists, dragging her into the black. The cold was bone deep, searing through silk and skin. Kim thrashed, nails raking empty air, rain blinding her eyes. The hands dragged relentlessly, fingers like ice, pulling her deeper into the maze. She choked a breath, heels scraping stone. "Let me go." The words tore out raw, swallowed by the storm. No answer, just shadows shifting, whispers threading through the dark. The hands released suddenly, sending her sprawling into mud and ivy. Kim gasped, palms stinging, eyes darting. The path stretched narrow and endless, hedges towering, branches clawing at the sky. The whispers grew soft and layered, like voices bleeding through walls. In the distance, the lantern's glow flickered, faint and beckoning. Kim forced herself up, knees trembling. The wind bit sharp, stinging her cheeks, but she stumbled forward, step by step, pulse thundering in her ears. Every turn seemed to twist back on itself, paths doubling, statues rearing with hollow eyes. And then she saw it. A clearing, moonlight slanting cold and silver. At the center stood a stone altar, draped in ivy, edges worn and cracked. Candles ringed it, flames wavering though no wind touched them. And on the altar, gleaming dark and cruel, lay the pendant, black stone veined with crimson, pulsing faintly. Kim's breath hitched. She took a step, then another, fingers trembling. The pendant seemed to hum, shadows twisting around its edges, whispering. "You shouldn't be here," a voice rasped behind her. Kim spun, heart leaping to her throat. A woman stood at the clearing's edge, pale, eyes dark and ancient, crimson gown trailing in wet grass. Lady Margaux. But her face was wrong, lips cracked and bloodless, eyes hollow and weeping ink. Kim stumbled back, breath sharp and shallow. "WH, what do you want?" "The debt," Margaux whispered, voice splintered and raw. "The bloodline must remain." Her eyes dropped to the pendant, glinting coldly. "Or they will take everything." I don't understand," Kim choked. But Margaux only smiled, lips peeling back. Her hand rose, fingers pale and skeletal, pointing past Kim's shoulder. Kim turned slowly, breath stalling. Figures stood at the clearing's edge, draped in black, faces masked and eyes gleaming. Their hands were clasped, heads bowed, blocking every path. And above them, dark clouds twisted, lightning arcing like veins. The pendant pulsed harder, shadows writhing. "Choose," Margaux rasped, eyes dark and endless. "The blood, or the legacy. But the debt must be paid." The masked figures took a step forward, boots sinking into mud, eyes fixed and unblinking. Kim's hand closed around the pendant, heart thundering. And the shadows lunged. The world blurred, shadows crashing in, fingers clawing. Kim staggered back, pendant pulsing cold and furious in her grip. Masked figures moved with eerie silence, eyes gleaming, robes whispering over wet grass. She bolted, feet slipping in mud, breath ragged. The path twisted, hedges rearing like walls, thunder roaring above. Every turn looped back, every shadow seemed to follow, eyes dark and hollow. The pendant pulsed, symbols flaring crimson. Kim's palm burned, but she clutched it tighter, desperate. Margaux's words echoed, soft and venomous. The debt must be paid. She broke into a small chapel, doors hanging askew, stained glass fractured. Candles lined the altar, flames sickly and wavering. Statues stared blankly, angels with cracked wings, eyes gouged dark. Kim stumbled forward, hands shaking. The pendant seared, symbols bleeding crimson light. She tried to wrench it off, but the chain tightened, almost alive, cutting into her skin. A whisper slid through the dark, soft, pleading. "Help me." She spun, breath shallow. Lady Margaux stood at the altar, face pale, eyes black in tears. But her gaze was softer now, almost human. "Please," Margaux rasped, voice splintered. "End this. Break the chain." Her fingers trembled, reaching, blood smeared on her palm. "They bound me here, bound the bloodline. If it isn't paid, they will take everything." Kim's pulse roared in her ears. "What do you mean? What debt?" But Margaux's eyes darkened, gaze flickering to the pendant. "The firstborn," she whispered, voice cracking. The air. It's always been the price. Kim's blood ran cold. No, no, I won't. But the door exploded inward, masked figures pouring in, eyes black and empty. Shadows twisted, candles snuffed out, darkness crashing forward. Kim screamed, fingers clenching the pendant, symbols flaring bright and savage. Cold fire seared her veins, shadows recoiled, hissing. For a breath, she saw them, faces beneath masks, eyes hollow, mouth stitched black, whispering. And then the altar cracked, light splintering out, and the floor gave way. She fell hard, breath punched out, cold stone biting. The pendant dimmed, symbols flickering weakly. Above, shadows writhed, clawing at the edges of the pit. But the darkness shifted, parted. A corridor stretched below, walls lined with portraits, eyes dark and unblinking. Candles guttered in iron sconces, air stale and heavy. And at the far end, a door loomed. Oak, carved with symbols that seemed to twist and writhe. A chill seeped through the cracks, bitter and ancient. Kim forced herself up, fingers bruised, pulse erratic. No way back, only forward. She took a step, then another, breath frosting in the dark. The door groaned open, shadows spilling out, and she stumbled through. The chamber was vast, ceilings arched, walls draped in crimson tapestries. And at the center, on a stone pedestal, lay a book bound in black leather, symbols glowing faintly. The pendant throbbed, heat spiking through her palm. But before she could move, the door slammed shut. A voice drifted from the dark, soft and cruel, echoing between columns. "Welcome home, Lady Margaux." The door's slam echoed, shadows creeping closer. Kim's pulse thundered, pendant cold and heavy at her throat. The chamber stretched vast and dark, the book on the pedestal pulsing faintly. The voice came again, smooth and taunting. "We've waited a long time." Kim's eyes darted, fingers trembling on the pendant. I'm not her," she stammered, backing away. Soft laughter rippled through the dark. Figures emerged, draped in black, eyes glinting beneath hoods. Their faces were hidden, but their eyes burned, empty and endless. "Blood doesn't lie," one hissed. The pendant seared hot, symbols flaring crimson. Kim gasped, knees buckling, vision splintering. The book's pages fluttered, ink bleeding into symbols she couldn't read. Whispers curled, soft and insidious. The debt must be paid. "No." Kim choked, fingers clawing at the chain. I didn't ask for this." The figures moved closer, boots scraping stone. The pedestal glowed brighter, shadows twisting. One reached forward, bony fingers, nails blackened, grasping for the pendant. Kim's hand snapped up, instinct wild and desperate. The pendant flared blinding white, light searing out. The figures recoiled, hissing, robes smoldering. She bolted, feet slipping on cold stone, breath ragged. Corridors twisted, walls narrowing, eyes watching from every portrait. A staircase spiraled upward, carved in obsidian. She took it, legs burning, shadows clawing at her heels. Every step sent agony lancing through her chest, lungs raw and breath hitching. She burst into a narrow hall, door hanging askew. Moonlight slanted through cracked glass, the storm still howling outside. But the whispers didn't stop, soft and venomous, seeping through the walls. She stumbled forward, fingers bleeding, eyes wild. The pendant dimmed, heat flickering weakly. And then, at the end of the hall, a figure blocked the exit, tall and cloaked, eyes glinting darkly beneath a hood. Kim froze, breath catching. The pendant pulsed once, weak and desperate. The figure's voice was cold, final. "You cannot escape the bloodline, Lady Margaux." The figure's eyes gleamed cold beneath the hood, voice smooth and final. Kim's back pressed to the wall, breath shallow, fingers clutching the pendant. The light had faded, symbols dim and lifeless, heat seeping away. "There's been a mistake," she choked, pulse thundering. I'm not her. I'm not Margaux." The figure tilted its head, smile curling. "The blood doesn't lie," it rasped. "You opened the door. You claimed the debt." Shadows twisted, floorboards groaning. Cold seeped through the walls, breath fogging white. Kim's fingers trembled on the pendant, raw and bleeding. "Please," she gasped, voice splintering. "I just want to leave." The figure stepped forward, boots clicking soft on stone. "There is no leaving," it murmured. "The house doesn't let go. Moonlight slanted through broken glass, painting the hall in shards of white and crimson. For a heartbeat, Kim saw them, figures cloaked in black, eyes hollow, lining the walls. Watching, the pendant pulsed weakly, light fluttering like a dying breath. The whisper came again, soft and pleading. "Break the chain." Kim's eyes flickered to the book, still on the pedestal, pages cracked and bleeding ink. An idea flared, wild, desperate. She lunged, boots scraping stone, breath tearing raw. Shadows surged, claws raking air, but her fingers closed around the book's spine, yanking it open. Pages fluttered, symbols bleeding crimson, light searing out. The figures recoiled, hissing. Darkness fractured, walls groaning. For a breath, Kim saw the way out. Corridor twisting to the main hall, front doors sagging open. She bolted, lungs burning, pendant searing like ice. Every step seemed to stretch, walls looping, eyes glinting from cracked portraits. Shadows clawed, whispers grew, voices layered and venomous. But the door was close, oak splintered, wind howling through the gap. Kim threw herself forward, fingers scraping wood, breath a sob. She burst outside, rain slashing cold, darkness swallowing the garden. Thunder cracked, blinding white, but the path stretched clear, gate yawning open, gravel glistening wet. For a heartbeat, she tasted freedom, wind sharp, rain searing. And then the gate swung shut, iron teeth snapping. Chains slithered up the posts, crimson symbols bleeding, shadows thickening. The pendant flared, burning her palm, and a whisper seethed through the dark. "You cannot escape." The lights in the mansion flickered, every window glowing crimson. Figures crowded the glass, eyes dark and hollow. The storm raged, wind screaming, but the whispers were louder, soft and venomous, threading through rain. Kim stumbled back, pulse wild, eyes darting. But every path was blocked, hedges rearing, shadows shifting, iron gates bound in chains. And at the mansion's highest window, Lady Margaux stared down, eyes dark and knowing, the pendant at her throat pulsing in sync with Kim's own. The rain was ice, searing through silk and skin. Kim's pulse pounded, eyes locked on the highest window, Lady Margaux's face pale and hollow, eyes dark and unblinking. The pendant at her throat pulsed faintly, in perfect sync with the one in Kim's grip. The gates were bound, chains glistening wet, symbols bleeding crimson. Every path twisted back, shadows shifting between trees, eyes glinting dark. Kim stumbled back, breath ragged. The whispers didn't stop, soft and venomous, seeping through the storm. The debt must be paid. "No," she gasped, fingers white-knuckled on the pendant. I won't do this." Thunder cracked, blinding white. For a heartbeat, the path cleared, iron gates yawning, rain slicing through mist. But the way out twisted, walls looping back on themselves, darkness stretching endlessly. The pendant seared, heat lancing through her palm. Kim choked back a cry, knees buckling, vision blurring. Symbols flared crimson, light searing out, and the whispers rose, angrier, desperate. "Break the chain." She ran, legs burning, mud clawing at her heels. The path stretched and twisted, every turn leading deeper into the dark. Statues loomed, eyes cracked and hollow, vines clawing through stone. The chapel doors reared up, oak splintered, candles flickering sickly. Kim stumbled inside, slamming them shut, breath tearing raw. The pendant dimmed, heat flickering weakly, light seeping into shadows. But the altar wasn't empty. A mirror stood propped against cracked stone, tall, glass warped and clouded. And through the fog, Kim saw herself, eyes wild, hair plastered to her cheeks. But the reflection moved slower, lips curving into a smile. Lady Margaux stared back, crimson gown trailing, eyes dark and hollow. The pendant at her throat gleamed, symbols flaring. Kim stumbled back, heart thundering. "What do you want?" she choked. The reflection's eyes glinted, cold and cruel. "Your blood," Margaux whispered, lips peeling back. "The debt must be paid." The pendant flared white-hot, light searing through veins, shadows splintering. Kim's knees hit stone, breath punched out, fingers clawing uselessly. And then, for a breath, the shadows parted, figures draped in black, eyes hollow, lining the chapel walls. Faces she recognized, portraits from the hall, eyes dark and unblinking. They moved as one, steps slow and silent, hands rising in unison. Cold fingers closed around her wrists, iron grips pulling her toward the altar, toward the mirror where Lady Margaux smiled darkly. The pendant pulsed, heat spiking, symbols flaring crimson. Kim thrashed, breath hitching, eyes wild. The mirror's surface rippled, ink bleeding, darkness yawning wide. Margaux's voice was soft, final. It's time. The hands yanked her forward, shadows roared, and the world fractured into black. Darkness swallowed everything cold and endless, pressing in from all sides. Kim's pulse thundered, breath shallow and raw. Fingers clawed at nothing, feet slipping on smooth stone, the pendant at her throat pulsing faintly, symbols bleeding crimson. She staggered forward, vision fractured, corridors stretched, shadows slithering along walls. The whispers were louder now, voices layered and venomous. The debt must be paid. Her fingers trembled on the pendant, nails chipped and bleeding. Please, she gasped, voice splintering. I just want to go home. A cold laugh rippled through the dark. Figures emerged, hoods low, eyes glinting, robes whispering over stone. They moved in unison, steps soft and deliberate, blocking every path. And at the center stood Lady Margaux, crimson gown trailing, eyes dark and endless. The pendant at her throat glinted, symbols pulsing in sync with Kim's own, cruel smile curling. You are home, Margaux whispered, voice smooth and final. This is where it began. This is where it ends. Kim's knees buckled, breath catching. Why me? I'm not you. I'm not part of this. Margaux's eyes glinted coldly. Blood doesn't lie. The line must remain unbroken. The pendant seared, heat lancing up Kim's throat, light flaring blinding white. Pain splintered through her skull, breath punched out. She choked, knees hitting stone, vision splintering. The whispers rose, hungry and eager. Shadows twisted, symbols bleeding into walls, light searing veins. But the pendant throbbed, almost desperately, light faltering. For a heartbeat, Kim felt it. Fear, raw and alive. Not her own. And then a voice, soft and pleading, almost human. Break the chain. Kim's eyes snapped to the book on the altar, pages cracked, symbols bleeding ink. The source. Her fingers clawed forward, nails raking stone, breath hitching. The figures surged, hands clawing, voices shrieking. Margaux's eyes darkened, lips curling. No, she hissed. The debt must. Kim's hand closed on the book's spine, yanking it open. Symbols flared, lights searing out, shadows recoiling with screams that tore raw and savage. The pendant shattered, shards biting skin. Light exploded, fire lancing through stone, corridors collapsing. The figures crumpled, robes smoldering, eyes glassy and empty. Margaux screamed, face cracking, eyes black and endless. Her fingers clawed for Kim, nails raking air, but the altar split, stone crumbling, light bleeding out, shadows splintering. Kim staggered back, eyes wide, breath ragged. The chapel groaned, walls splitting, moonlight slicing through cracks. Thunder roared, wind howling, and the storm poured in, cold and cleansing. For a breath, Margaux's eyes softened, human, almost pleading. Lips moved silently, words lost to the wind. And then the light swallowed everything. Morning broke dull and gray, rain glistening on cracked stone. The mansion loomed silent, windows dark, ivy clawing through shattered glass. Paramedics murmured, boots crunching gravel, faces pale. Sirens wailed faintly, lights flashing red and blue. Kim sat on the steps, robes soaked and torn, eyes shadowed and glassy. Her hands trembled in the blanket, pulse slow and numb. North's arms wrapped tight, breath hitching. Mom. Her voice was small, cracked. Can we go home now? Kim's eyes drifted back to the mansion, portraits scorched, symbols dark and lifeless. The pendant lay cracked on the stone, symbols cold and dead. She swallowed, throat raw, fingers white-knuckled on North's shoulder. Yeah, Kim rasped, voice hollow. We're going home. But as she looked back one last time, she could have sworn, at the highest window, a face watched pale and hollow, eyes dark and unblinking. Lady Margaux smiled, lips curling faintly, and the shadows seemed to whisper, "This isn't over."